I just want to thank Marco and Rocco for inviting me because this is my first time in Italy and wow, you're really good at desserts. And yeah, I'm not pregnant, this is all just gelato. Um, I also want to thank the interpreters who I've been watching all day and they've been doing such an amazing job. And this is the first time I've done a talk that's being interpreted. And I know how much hard work it is, so thank you very much. So this talk is about documentation. Please don't leave. Documentation may not be as exciting as CSS transforms or WebGL, but it's vital to a project's success. I'm sure you've all had this experience where you launch a site and it was such hard work, but it was worth it because it looks amazing. It's a work of art. The client is happy, you're so proud, and you put it on your portfolio site and move on to the next project. Then, a few months later, some new designers and developers come in and they make some little adjustments. They use styles that don't quite fit with the content, add huge images that slow the site down, throw in a bunch of fonts, and pretty quickly it looks terrible. So you quickly remove the link to the site from your portfolio. But whose fault is this? The next person who works on your project isn't a mind reader. They're not going to know why you've made certain decisions. If they're very new, they might not even know about best practices like optimizing images or why it's bad to use lots of web fonts. And that's why we create documentation. Explaining where and when different pieces of content should be used forces you to think about your site as a system rather than as a series of pages. And the act of writing it also forces you to think about why you're doing things in a certain way. And this is where style guides come in. Style guides are a type of documentation that encourages people, be they designers, developers, or content producers, to follow a set of rules that help maintain visual consistency. And there are actually many different types of style guide, which I'll briefly walk you through. So you've probably all seen branding guidelines. These often go into obsessive detail about logo placement, color usage, and typography. They're usually entirely geared towards print, with the white space around the logo unhelpfully noted in millimeters, and the color scheme in Pantones, which never translate well to the web. Print guidelines go into even more detail. This is one of many guidelines for the UK's National Health Service, or NHS, for their print material. It's important for an organisation like the NHS to have these so that people trust the message that's being communicated, and also to make sure that the design is created in a way that is accessible to as many people as possible. With any organisation this big, it's quite common for these guidelines to be ignored, which is bad if you're trying to communicate a message that could be the difference between life and death. So I want to be sure that this defibrillator is going to work when I use it. And having such a playful font is, well, I'm just a bit worried about what is actually going to be in there when I open the box. Content guidelines focus on the way in which it's appropriate to communicate. So when you've got lots of people working on a project, it's important that you sound consistent with the brand. MailChimp's tone of voice for a success message, fine piece of work, you totally deserve a raise, is going to be very different to the way that, say, your bank tells you that your payment has gone through. Content guidelines also help keep language consistent with the house style, from whether a word such as email should have a hyphen in it, to what overused phrases to avoid. So The Guardian and Observer's style guide was the first to publicly appear on the web. These newspapers have a lot of journalists, so they wanted to make it as easy as possible for them to check the style guide, whether they're writing a story at their desk or on the road. And we have similar style guides for code too. So when there are multiple developers working on the same project, it's good to maintain a consistent style to the way that you write code to avoid conflicts and to make it easier for everyone to know where things live. And finally, there are style guides built specifically for websites, which I sometimes refer to as front-end style guides. And these are what I'll be focusing on today. They'll often contain a mixture of all the ones I just showed you, and unlike a regular style guide, they're interactive, so you can hover over a link and it will change state. You can highlight the text. It's like an instruction manual for building and maintaining a specific website. So there isn't a specific type of front-end style guide that is going to fit every project. There are many different techniques for building up a style guide for the web. Some of them will be ideal if you work in an agile way with developers. Others are more suited to if you're a designer who is more comfortable in graphic software rather than code. So here are a few different techniques that you can try. If you have an existing site or you want to create a style guide from, or just consolidate styles, the first thing that you can try is something called an interface inventory. Brad Frost came up with the term, and to demonstrate it, he went to his bank's website, and very simply, he took screenshots of all the different styles of buttons on the website that he could find. And there are dozens, and this is just for one site, one brand. It's a good way of finding out how consistent your styles are, and it's so easy to do. You're basically going to go through the site like you would a content audit and gather as many different styles as possible, group them by function, and put them all in a slide deck. But don't just stop at buttons. You can also create inventories of all these different design elements. If you're trying to convince someone of the value of creating a style guide for a site, do a quick interface inventory on it just to highlight how many styles could be consolidated. Of course, this is only practical if you have an existing site, but let's say you wanted to start from scratch or completely revamp a current design. Samantha Warren is a web designer with a background in art, and she quickly realized that creating beautiful website mock-ups at the start of a project and presenting them to the client was wasting a lot of time, because sometimes the visual style that she'd come up with was completely not what the client was hoping for. But it wasn't until she'd shown them something that they started talking about what they did want. So she was trying to think of a way to facilitate this conversation about a design without creating a pixel-perfect mock-up. She then tried creating mood boards for clients. So mood boards like you would use for interior design, but she found them too abstract at all. They felt too disconnected from a website, and clients would often already have a mood board made as part of a rebranding exercise. So then she created something called style tiles. They're in between mood boards and mock-ups. They contain snippets of design elements, but they're not presented like a website. It's meant as a tool for conversation rather than a fixed deliverable. And they're less risky than presenting a finished comp to a client. Since they're quick to make, you can create a few for the client to choose from and ask them, is this the impression that you're going for? They remove that dangerous big reveal stage of a project where the client takes one look at your hard work and says, no, that's not us at all. So here's how a style tile is put together. The most important aspect of a style tile are these words that are used to describe the feeling that the design should evoke. And each tile has different words. So one might say conservative, whereas another tile might say modern. And these words influence the typography that's chosen, which is also different for each tile. There are some small design snippets that give a very rough idea of what some design elements might look like in practice. The color palette is shown. And finally, each style tile has a version number. After coming up with a style tile that the client liked, Samantha was then able to work on a mock-up incorporating these styles, and this is what it looks like. Dan Moore has a very similar approach called element collages. Like style tiles, they're a tool to facilitate conversations, but they come a little bit further along in the design process. And you could even make one after creating some style tiles. And here's what one looks like. It's not a mock-up of a page, It's a digital scrapbook of ideas. And here Dan is prototyping some styles for how the buttons will work and how the donation fields will look. This technique is perfect for designers who aren't yet comfortable putting their designs straight into code, but want to move away from doing full comps. The most valuable thing that element collages do is that they focus the client on how that feature will work, regardless of what size screen it's on. Now that we have an infinite number of devices and screen sizes and resolutions to worry about, breaking out of the canvas entirely helps the designer and the client to think more about how something is going to work in the context of the site as a whole, rather than on a specific page. Design agency Clearleft have been trying out element collages in their design phase. And one problem that they encountered was that their explorations were looking too much like pages, and the client didn't really understand what it was they were being shown. As you can see in this collage, although the various modules shown wouldn't all be found on the same page, it still looks a bit too website-like. So they found that a better way to present the element collages was on a wide horizontal canvas rather than a long vertical one. This is an element collage that John Aizlewood of Clearleft worked on for Code for America. So here he's thinking about how to style block quotes, and he's toying with two very different styles that he's going to ask the client their opinion about. Style prototypes are the next step along, and they're basically element collages but in code. And they skip the sitting in Photoshop phase and enable you to mock up something really quickly for feedback. They're prototypes of some of the content elements on a page, but these are all mocked up in HTML rather than in Photoshop. So they adapt to different screen widths, and you can try it out in the environment that it's designed for. And this gives a much more realistic impression of what the finished thing will feel like to use. I build style prototypes in practically every project. So the designer only has to use Photoshop for assets like icons. And the rest of the time, they're handing me sketches, which I roughly mock up, they tweak, and that gets presented to the stakeholder. This is an ideal approach if you have a hybrid designer and developer on your team, because the code doesn't have to be great, it's a prototype after all. It's best to start building them during the design phase. It might seem strange to jump into code so early on in a project, but it means that you can test out ideas quickly before writing proper code. Teams of developers might maintain a code standards document. Harry Roberts, see him down there, he's a front-end developer who maintains his own CSS guidelines, and it's been so popular that he's created a whole site for it. Thank you, Harry. CSS guidelines are just one example. They could be written about HTML, PHP, basically whatever language is used on a site. Ideally, they need to be written before you start building. In Harry's CSS guidelines, it contains not just how to format CSS in a consistent way, but why it should be done in this way. Coding standards should evolve over time in response to changes in specifications and accessibility best practice. A good set of guidelines will tell you what to do, so keep selectors as short as possible. A great set of guidelines will tell you why, so keep selectors as short as possible in order to keep specificity down and performance up. An excellent set of guidelines will go one step further and back up reasoning with further reading. This is invaluable for new developers working on your team as it helps them learn best practices. If you're at a more stable part of a project where the developers are building out components, then something like pattern primer, so this is a term that Jeremy Keith of Clearleft uses, is going to be more useful as an ongoing piece of documentation. This is the main type of style guide that I'm going to be diving into, as the idea is that it's not a throwaway deliverable, it's a system, a living, breathing, evolving library of components. Each component or module, each small piece of the design, is referred to as a pattern. They're like Lego blocks. They're independent of each other and can live on their own or alongside other patterns to form pages. And you might hear the term pattern library used. A pattern primer is a pattern library. It's just what Jeremy likes to call his. Before Natalie Down co-founded Lanyard, she was a front-end developer at Clearleft, and when she was developing a new pattern, she'd add it to a long page which had all of the patterns on it. And this is where Jeremy's evolved from. The difference between Natalie's version and Jeremy's is that Jeremy's separates the patterns from the page template and shows the markup alongside the pattern. Pattern libraries are built using the same markup and the same styles as a live site to keep it as accurate a representation as possible of the site. But this is not the only deliverable that Jeremy gives to the client. He'll also mock up a few pages, but with the intention that the client can use the pattern library to assemble new pages going forward. It might seem like a lot of work up front to get set up with a style guide, but as you'll see, they'll more than make up for it in the long term. So when you're working with a really big site, the design and the code can get out of sync very quickly. A style guide is a good check and balance. It's something that can be used to make sure that you're staying on track. And this is especially important if you have a sprawling site with multiple people working on it, like Starbucks. So they have a pattern library, and it's fantastic that they've made it public. It contains things like the grid systems that they use, various layout modes, dialog boxes, and form styles. And this documentation is especially useful for when external developers are brought in to work on a site. Things like form validation styles can be reused, so Starbucks now don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they introduce a new section to their site, or worse, duplicate a style that already exists. You can have your style guide as part of your QA flow. Because everything's on one page, it's faster to test. You can easily spot style conflicts and quickly drill down to a specific element that is causing things to break. Normally, markup is hidden behind view source, but by displaying the code on the page alongside the pattern, your team can help to spot errors in the code. And it's going to encourage you to write better code if you're effectively showing it off to everyone. Another nice thing you can do is install a browser plugin called Totally. It's spelt with ones replacing the L's. And that toggles common accessibility issues, like color contrast. Here it's flagging up where my text doesn't contrast enough with the background to be easily readable to people with low vision. Because my patterns are all in a style guide, I can test them all at once without having to go through every single template I've built. When you're rapidly iterating, a lot of inconsistencies can creep in. So when you do a code review, having all of your modules in one place helps keep track of what's new, what's a duplicate, and what's not being used. I talked earlier about Brad Frost's interface inventory. It's a pattern library. It basically is a built version of that. Chris Coyer decided to create a pattern library of his app, CodePen. Even though he built the thing himself, he was really surprised by just how many button styles there were. So doing an audit on your site is a really great thing to do because a lot of these styles can be consolidated. That way you end up with a more consistent design and leaner code. If you can build elements straight in code using something like style prototypes, you're going to give a much more realistic representation of what a design is going to look and feel like. You can immediately show it on different devices and browsers and get an idea straight away of if that design is going to work in practice. This helped me a lot on a project where right at the start we tested a prototype just of the typography in different browsers, and we found that it looked terrible on Windows machines. So we went with a different typeface. If we'd left this until build, we wouldn't have tested it. We haven't have realized this until it was too late to change anything. So one of the best ways that you can make sure your style guide is kept up to date is to have someone on the team who is kind of an evangelist of it. Someone who keeps it in check and makes sure that new patterns are always added to it. Like there's an entire team at Marriott Hotel who just maintain their style guides. And while most places are unlikely to be able to justify that, having someone on your team who is in charge of regularly checking the style guide is up to date and being maintained, and nagging others to contribute to it and refer to it, is going to go a long way. Think of that person as the gatekeeper for new content or functionality. GitHub, a company who hire a lot of developers, have their own standards for writing HTML and CSS, organizing files, and the reasoning behind why they do particular things. And this makes the onboarding process for new employees a lot easier because they can point them to these documents. Style guides can also be used to measure how much different features are going to affect performance. Like Tim told us earlier today about working with Superfriendly on Radio Free Europe's redesign, they were told that because of the nature of the content, some of the site's users had been jailed or hanged just for accessing the site. So performance in this project was critical. And they were thinking about it during the design phase as they were building up an element collage. And Tim created a grunt task which measured how fast each pattern is loading. Lonely Planet also output their performance stats straight in their style guide. Each file has performance stats logged in the style guide, and changes to these are highlighted and plotted on a graph. And this is great for the development team to see which areas can be optimized and to make the most impact. Since this is all public, it also creates more of an incentive to optimize aggressively, and its prominence helpfully prevents file size creeping up too much with each release. Pattern libraries are a fantastic tool for rapid prototyping. Federico, who works on MailChimp, used theirs as a way to quickly build up new pages or update existing ones. So he managed to test out an idea using real code that was also responsive in just 20 minutes. And he did this by slotting together existing patterns. Building things in this modular way is becoming a revolution, not just in web design, but also in the real world. So I saw in the news a story about a 57-floor building that had been built in just 19 days because it had been built in a modular way, mostly off-site. No matter how good your documentation is, don't use it to replace talking with the client or the rest of your team. So this isn't something that you're going to build, hand over, and that's it. Dan Moore has adopted the goal that every deliverable that he hands over has to come with a proper conversation. Also, don't wait until the end of a project to build one. Start putting it together from day one. Otherwise, it's likely to be this snapshot in time that people are less likely to maintain because they don't feel invested in it. Like Gina says, if it's not part of your workflow, you're asking for it to become outdated. That being said, you can still make one if a site already exists. So this is one I locked together for a list apart long after the site had gone live to help keep track of what styles there are. It's important to think about who you're building your style guide for. So is it for a team of developers? Is it for an editorial team adding content to a CMS? That will dictate what kind of a message you choose to convey. You should also consider how strict you want it to be. Are they a set of guidelines that are open to interpretation? Or are they rules that need to be followed? I tend to lean toward more relaxed guidelines, but it will really depend on the project. So if I were working with an external agency who maybe I wasn't so confident in their ability to deliver quality code, I'd probably go for stricter language like you must rather than you should. This is Code for America's style guide. Each design pattern that appears on the site is built in isolation, and multiple patterns can be assembled together like Lego blocks. They have a microsite for each city, so their guidelines are very relaxed because they wanted to allow people more creativity in approaching their city's microsite to its individual needs and culture. So in the style guide, each pattern has a unique name that the team can refer to. The pattern itself is displayed at full width with the idea being that it can adapt and slot into any space. It has the code that you would need to write to reproduce the pattern, a description of when that pattern is appropriate to use. So here I'm explaining that this pattern should be used as a call to action. And it also has a link to the pattern on its own page for debugging process. So each pattern is a discrete file, a bit like an include file. And you can even keep them in an includes folder if you want. By isolating each pattern, you'll make building templates a quicker and easier process. And if you're using SAS or less, these files should have the same name as pattern files so that they're easier to find, and so you can see that the matching files are related. Everything is self-contained so that if the pattern becomes obsolete, the components can be easily removed. The style guide uses a compiled version of the main site styles so that it's the same as on the website. But I also like to add some CSS just for the style guide, which I don't include in the production site. I prefix all class names on the style guide, so things like the pattern wrapper with .xx, so that they'll never clash with the main site styles. I then set up a function that loops through all the pattern files and spits each of them out onto one page. And I add things like color swatches and typography straight into the style guide, as I'm not going to reuse these patterns anywhere on the production site. I then add some code to the function that outputs a markup for that pattern next to the pattern itself. The width of the patterns should be independent of layout so that you can fit them into any space. That way, if the layout changes, you won't have to update the patterns. They'll just work anywhere. This technique is essential for responsive websites. I've been working on my own Jekyll version of a pattern library. Jekyll is a static site generator that also plays nicely with GitHub, which hosts my site. So when I commit a change to the style guide, that change automatically gets pushed to the live site. The patterns live in a Jekyll collection, which means I can loop through all the files and output them all on one page. And I've also added content in the YAML front matter of each file, which gets displayed as part of each pattern. I then have a grunt task that copies the pattern files into the includes folder, strips out the YAML so that I can use exactly the same patterns on the site as are in the style guide. Brad Frost and Dave Olson have created Pattern Lab. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. It does a lot of really cool things, like letting you randomly change the width of the container and search for all the patterns. It's an excellent starting point for a project. It uses PHP, but there are ports for Node and .NET. There are some tools out there that will even generate a style guide for you based on comments in your CSS. So this is KSS, or Nile Style Sheets. It does this with the aim to make your style guide easier to maintain. So you write comments in this way with the various states, and KSS will look through all these and generate a style guide from them all. Tools like Frontify do a similar job. So they generate a style guide for you, displaying things like color swatches and typography used, and make it accessible from anywhere. And they also have a discussion feature. And this is really good for if your team works remotely or if your client works off-site and you want to make communication as clear and collaborative as possible. It's so important that your style guide is available from outside the internal network, because often external agencies will need to use it. People are also more likely to refer to it if it's easily accessible. But my favorite tool is Typecast, because it promotes a content-first approach. I'm not sure it can really be called a style guide because it doesn't generate stuff like color swatches for you, but it's great as a first step towards making one. It's purely for prototyping your typography and helping you build a solid foundation in the browser. So you can tweak padding, margin, and line heights, and it generates fairly decent CSS. I recommend designers use this to nail the typography before they open Photoshop and start designing templates. This is because Photoshop is really terrible at showing what type will actually look like in the browser. So please don't design your typography in Photoshop. Use this instead. There are a few key features your front-end style guide should have, as well as a lot of optional ones. Before you do anything, start with the basics. Just raw HTML elements without any CSS classes. So things like heading levels, default paragraphs, links, tables, form input boxes. And you can reuse this HTML on any project. And it's great to sit down with the designer and tweak things with them, like line heights, to make sure you've got a really decent typographic grounding for the site. I like to use Paul Lloyd's Barebones, which has all the raw HTML elements, along with an explanation of when you should use them. The design is really nice and it's minimal, so you might want to use his CSS as a starting point as well. After you've put in some basic elements, start adding patterns. Aim to only include the patterns that you actually need. So it's tempting to want to show everything in your boilerplate, but be realistic. While it's nice to have, are you ever likely to need a style for the keyboard element? I'm so guilty of this because I want to add everything that I can think of to my style guides, just in case. But it doesn't help make the code any leaner. I have a toolbox at home that is full of things I don't use. It has multiple things that I've got more than one of, parts for furniture that I don't have anymore, and things that I've kept just in case I might need them. MailChimp Style Guide says that they only add new patterns when there's a sound case for doing so, because new patterns come at a high cost in terms of design elements, additional code, and maintenance. They say that new patterns also increase the cognitive load on users, and I get that cognitive load when I'm searching for a particular tool in my toolbox. They know that the more that they add to their pattern library, the more features they have to support and the more complex the library gets. So they are very careful about what patterns that they add to the site. So only add patterns when they're needed. Alongside your patterns, show the markup that's needed to replicate it. This is Salesforce's, and they have a fantastically detailed design system documentation. You should really check it out. I like to put my code behind a show hide so that the page doesn't get too long, but Salesforce have so many patterns that they've split them onto multiple pages. So they make all of their markup visible on the page without hiding it. This is usually HTML, but really it should be whatever language that someone who is building the site would need to recreate that pattern. So South Tees, it's a hospital. Their site is built in WordPress, so their code examples are WordPress shortcode. Someone without any knowledge of HTML can easily add components to a new page in the WordPress editor view without having to open up a code editor. It also means if the markup changes further down the line, the shortcode should stay the same. You may also want to show the CSS. Salesforce actually display the Sass used for their patterns. I wonder how useful this is because unlike the markup, a pattern CSS in isolation is missing the global style, so it's not possible to replicate using just that snippet. But it is useful as a learning tool for other people to see how it's made. Don't forget to show extremes, such as this really long heading which I've put in to make sure it doesn't look weird when the text wraps. Also show what happens when people do things that you might not expect, like having two headings next to each other. And as you go, check the patterns on different devices and browsers, and also make a habit of switching off JavaScript to make sure that your fallbacks work. Adding notes is especially useful for back-end developers who need to understand the logic to certain styles. So here there are groups that could have any of three different states to signify whether it's a public group, which is the default state, a private group, or a group that the user is already a member of. So there are some notes explaining what these three different styles indicate. Color swatches are a really nice thing to add to a style guide. For Code for America's style guide, each color swatch has its own name, hex code, and RGB value. If I'm using less or SAS, I also like to include the variable name so I can quickly reference it when I'm coding. Many style guides, like MailChimp's, document how to set up their grid. It can take a while to set up this documentation the first time that you do it, but they're a solid investment because they make building templates going forward so easy. And they also force you to think about why you're building it in a particular way, which can in turn improve the quality of your code and your design. I've seen some really lovely examples of grids in style guides, like Starbucks, which has toggles for showing the grid as a layer, like you can do in Photoshop. And it's ideal for checking whether something is lining up properly. If you've got animations on your site, document these too to keep the styles and timings consistent. Write up when you use specific ones. So Salesforce's style guide has a fascinating section on how they use animation. Google also have a fantastic guide called Material Design that includes a lengthy animation section. And both Salesforce's and Google's are among the best examples of style guides I've seen, so I highly recommend you check them out. Something that is frequently neglected on a site is right-to-left styles. So for this style guide, I added a right-to-left toggle that switched the text direction of all the patterns. That way, I could easily see if I'd written my CSS in a way that broke the design for languages that are displayed in this way. After a while, your style guide is going to get pretty long, so you might want to drop in some navigation like a jump link select box or some navigation to the side. I prefer jump links because I like my patterns to fill the entire width of the screen so that I can test whether they respond nicely at very big sizes without the navigation getting in the way. A style guide that's out of date is almost as useless as no style guide at all. The challenge for the coming months and years is making ones that are powered by the live site that use the same styles, the same content, and the same code base. A lot of style guides are built separately from the site, and the code can get out of sync over time. Gina calls these zombie style guides when they're unloved and unmaintained. Don't let your style guide become a zombie style guide. Lonely Planet have a clever strategy to stop theirs becoming zombified. They've hooked it up to an API, meaning that the markup used is synced with the live site, and they call their system Rizzo. Rather than have HTML snippets, they display the code needed to pull in the markup. To show you an example, this code outputs a card with a cover image, and the parameters can be modified to change the output. So taking this example, if I wanted to show this same pattern but with an author credit, we can add a couple of lines for the author name and avatar, and they appear. And this tackles a problem where components may become out of date, such as if the markup changes. It also means if you have multiple components that share a lot of the same markup, you're not duplicating the code. Ian Feather, formerly of Lonely Planet, credits the success of their style guide to this API. And he mentioned that he'd built 2 before that became zombie style guides. But because of the API, he doesn't have to actively maintain this one. Even the best style guides can be improved. It feels like everyone is still seeking that holy grail, the style guide that needs minimal maintenance, that everyone feels invested in, that is easy to update, and that stays up to date. And that's usually a lot easier for an in-house team to achieve than an agency who hand a style guide over as a deliverable. So Dan Mull talked to me about baking in time after the project to revisit the style guides that they deliver to clients. I think this is brave because it's admitting that the system that they've delivered is probably not going to be perfect the first time round. So they use this time to see what's working, what's not working, how they can be improved, and make tweaks based on this feedback. And I think this should be true for any project. It's not right to just throw a bunch of documentation to a client, hope for the best, and dust your hands of it. External teams should be making more of ongoing relationships with clients because they are the most rewarding. And I just want to stress the value of making it public. So other than being a really nice thing to do that helps the community, there are two very good reasons for this. One is that it keeps you honest. So you're going to be more likely to maintain the thing if other people can see it. And the second thing is that it's a recruitment tool. Several people I've talked to have said that they joined a company after seeing the style guide. And if you build one and it's good, you're going to have people like Gina knocking on your door. Lonely Planet's style guide has also helped them with recruitment too. By making their tool Rizzo public and open source, it means that some of their new recruits are already familiar with working with the tool before they've even started. My final piece of advice is don't be intimidated by how all these examples look. It doesn't have to be a work of art. That's not the point. Sure, it helps if it looks nice because people will feel more proud of it, but it's meant as a tool. Start small and simple and build upon it as and when you can. If you want to know more, I set up a repository on GitHub that brings together stuff about style guides. It has over 300 resources that have all been added by the community. You might want to check this out if you're looking for more ideas and inspiration on creating a style guide. I also ran a little podcast with Brad Frost that Pierre mentioned. It's all about style guides. It's just a short run thing with a total of 12 guests, 12 episodes, 30 minutes long. A lot of the quotes in this presentation were directly from that podcast. And I've also written a book about the topic. It's £2 and it goes into a lot more detail about everything that I've just talked about. Thank you very much.